Good evening, friends. A warm welcome to all. Today, the webinar is on GST provisions on charitable and educational entities. Services provided by entity registered under Section 5AA of the Income Tax Act 1961, while way of charitable activities are exempted from whole of GST only if the following conditions are satisfied. Entities must be registered under Section 12AA of Income Tax Act, and such activities or activities by the are by way of charitable activities. And for this, we have our guest speaker, CA Yash Dhadda ji. He is having a working experience of over 10 years in the field of indirect taxes. He was especially invited to the Indirect Tax Committee of ICAI for the term 2018-19 and 1920. He is also on panel of CII as GST, Service Tax and Excise Advisor for the industry members. He has represented ICAI in Regional Advisory Committee, Rajasthan, under aegis of Chief Commissioner of Excise and Customs, Jaipur. He is founding core member of study group of ICI on GST research and upgradation matters. He is also a mentor of a pan-India community of indirect tax professionals named GST World. He has written handbooks on principles of classification for goods and services under GST and also on casual taxable person for IDTC of ICAI. As his patient, he is also engaged in grooming young professionals of CA, CS, and MD on topics of soft skills and professional life management. And we have with us none other than CA Vivek Khuranaji, founder of CA Sansaar. And his name is just enough for the CS. Now, I would request him to welcome him and give him a welcome address. So, please.
Thank you, Stuti ji. CA Yash Dhadda ji, speaker of today's webinar, CA Stuti Mahajan ji, all other respected member of the profession. A warm welcome to all of you on today's very important topic, GST provisions on charitable and educational entities. Last month we had organized a webinar on the income tax provision, and after that we have received many requests that whether we can conduct a webinar on the GST provision on the charitable and educational entities, and we had requested to Yashji, but at that time he was some issues of the COVID of his staffs, so he was so much busy. But today he gave us the time. So my sincere thanks to Yashji, and I think he is the better person who will guide us regarding the GST provision in the charitable and the educational entities, because sometimes we are not aware which kind of provision, because mainly we know about maximum things about the income tax, but GST little bit we are not aware. So my once again thanks to Yashji, and now over to Yashji. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, you can see the screen, sir, right? Sir, you are able to see the screen?
Yes, I forget to tell about you are this moving ahead. Yes. Because
Okay.
this is a sign of GST website.
Right, sir. So, good evening to all the members of CS Sansaar family. First of all, I would like to thank Vivek ji, Stuti ji for giving me this warm introduction, and also thank you for inviting me. My sincere apologies that Vivek ji had contacted me a month back regarding this topic, and I had given my consent for it, but unfortunately, due to a COVID situation at my office, it was very difficult for me to take a session at that point of time. So I was unable to do so. But thank you for inviting me again. I think this is for the third time that I'm speaking at the CS Ansar platform, and it is always a pleasure to come here and speak and interact with all the members, because after the session, the questions are always very interesting, very thought-provoking. I'm sure that after today's session also, we'll have a lot of questions of which hopefully I'll be able to give some answer from my side. So today's topic is very interesting. And when I say interesting, because in GST, all of us understand that majority of the things are under the garb of taxation. In a sense that we know that under GST now, because it is a tax on supply of goods and services, and the understanding of the government has been, or the legislature has been, that the exemption should be minimized. Yeah, these two sectors specifically, that is educational institutions and charitable institutions, they have been kept out of GST. Now, when we say that they have been kept out of GST, the understanding in the common or the normal domain is that means that any activity which is undertaken by an educational institution or any activity which is undertaken by a charitable institution, that is not liable to GST. However, all of us, I'm sure when we look at from the income tax perspective, when we do the audit of these institutions, when we sign the financial statements, we realize there are some tidbits of income which are either rental incomes, or maybe some amount of grant is coming specifically, or there is some amount of any other amount is coming please pardon, which is not exactly in relation to education, or which we cannot say that it is an outcome of the educational activity which has been done, or it is an outcome of the charitable activity which has been done. And then the question arises whether this particular institution, is it really exempted from GST, or there is something in it for which there is a requirement to take a registration under GST. Now, interestingly, because all these institutions, be it a school or a college or any other educational institution or a charitable institutions, they are being run by a group of people, and those group of people generally do this activity as a philanthropy, and they do this activity not as one of their main commercial activities. So that means when they come together to undertake any of such activities of this sort, they only come together because they want to ensure that they can give back to the society. अब इस बैकग्राउंड के अंदर what generally happens is, अगर कोई एक ऐसा एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन है जिसको बोला जाए कि आपके पास ये जो रेंटल इनकम आ रहा है, लेट्स से दैट एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन हैज एन एटीएम which is being part of their premises, और वो एटीएम सिर्फ इसलिए लगा रखा है जिसलिए वहां पे जो बच्चे पढ़ते हैं और जो फैकल्टीज हैं और जो टीचर्स हैं, वो अगर उनको बाय चांस कभी पैसों की अर्जेंट जरूरत हो तो वहां से वो कैश विड्रॉ कर सके, एंड दैट्स द ओनली पर्पस, एंड फॉर दैट दे गिव स्पेस टू द बैंक installs the ATM machine, they have a guard there, and against that they pay a specific amount of rent to the educational institution. Now the point which comes is कि ये रेंटल इनकम आ रही है, रेंटल के ऊपर जीएसटी लगता है, तो क्यों ना इस एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन को जीएसटी में रजिस्ट्रेशन करा दिया जाए और सिर्फ इस छोटी सी रेंटल इनकम के ऊपर जीएसटी पे कर दिया जाए. The problem is that once this happens, when somebody enters into that zone where you tell them that yes, you are required to take a registration under GST, एंड ये जो आपकी एंसिलरी एक्टिविटीज है या जो एडिशनल एक्टिविटीज है या जिनको हम अदर इनकम के नाम से जानते हैं, इसके ऊपर जीएसटी लगता है, तो इसे एक छोटे से पोर्शन के ऊपर जीएसटी जमा करा दीजिए, एंड रेस्ट ऑल अदर्स इट इज आउटसाइड द एम्बिट ऑफ जीएसटी. Unfortunately, the complication starts from there only, because once somebody becomes an assessee here, then there are a lot of other things which that person is basically trying to propagate to the government. There are a lot of things which government is trying to indirectly explain to the government, and then we'll see whether it will have some implication on the income tax side also. Though I don't practice in income tax, neither I say that I am aware about the provisions properly, but I would like to bring draw a parallel to this regard by saying that if I am saying that I am registered under GST and I am paying tax on certain activities, can I go back to income tax and say no, under income tax, whatever benefits are available to me as a charitable institution or whatever benefits are available to me as an education institution, I deserve them and they should be continued to me. So in this background, we'll keep our discussion. So again, before we go to the specifics of the topic, कुछ चीजें हैं जो इन दोनों के बारे में हम सब जानते हैं, बट ये बैकग्राउंड में ध्यान रखना बड़ा जरूरी है. पहला, हम जिन दो सेक्टर्स के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं वो जनरली दे आर नॉट वर्किंग इन फॉर्म ऑफ ए कंपनी, एलएलपी और अ पार्टनरशिप फर्म. रादर वी विल फाइंड अ ट्रस्ट, वी विल फाइंड अ सोसाइटी, और वी विल फाइंड एनी अदर कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एज सच, बट नॉट these typical constitutions where we say that जितनी भी कमर्शियल एक्टिविटीज होती हैं वो जनरली कंपनी, एलएलपी और पार्टनरशिप फर्म करते हैं या एनी ऑफ दिस सॉर्ट करते हैं. पहला डिसीजन वहां पे आ जाता है कि इनका जो इनकॉर्पोरेशन है, इनका जो सेटअप है, वो अपने आप में ऐसा है जहां पे एट द फर्स्ट इंस्टेंस ओनली एनीबडी इज लुकिंग एट देम, दे आर ट्राइंग टू से दैट वी आर नॉट एंगेज इन एन एक्टिविटी व्हिच इज कमर्शियल इन नेचर. Second is the objective for which they are formed, and the objective which is written, maybe in form of bylaws, maybe in form of a constitution, maybe in any other form. that clearly brings out that they want to do an activity which is not for the purpose of earning profits. Though at the end of the day they might have surplus, though at the end of the day they might be earning some additional revenue, but the purpose for which they are formed, that purpose is very specific. Either it will be education, or either it will be religious activity, or either it will be some kind of a charitable activity which has been defined. Third, they will have registration with some or the other charity commissioner or some of the other institution which only registers these type of organizations. And again, it will also differentiate them with others. That in a sense to say that अगर मान लीजिए कोई religious एक कोई मंदिर है या कोई एक religious trust है, तो वो generally हम सबके अपनी अपनी cities के अंदर एक देवस्थान करके you would find a place where they would be required to get themselves registered, or we have charity commissioners under the state jurisdiction where they would like to get themselves registered. Then all of us know under income tax, and as Vivek ji was also highlighting, that we have a separate mechanism and provision altogether. In fact, there is a section which all of us know, 12AA of the Income Tax Act, which also has a reference under GST. They are given a special status there. They're given a special registration there. They have certain restrictions on utilization of funds. And in fact, to some extent, anybody who is making payment to them, so that they can help them, assist them in getting their objective achieved, जिसको हम डोनेशन के फॉर्म में जानते हैं, उसको भी इंसेंटिफाई करने के लिए there are specific provisions in the Income Tax Act. And last but not the least, and very important, the receipts which all these types of organizations have, they might have a receipt in form of a fees, they might have a receipt in form of a cess, they might have a receipt in form of a specific amount or a charge, but majority of them also have a receipt which is in form of a donation. And donation, all of us know that they are generally voluntary in nature, they are gratuitous in nature. Against that, nobody can clearly point out कि ये donation देने के पीछे का purpose ये था that I was something expecting in return. And that's what we sometimes call this donation as a grant. Though there is some difference between donation and a grant, because against donation, I am not sure that is the specific purpose for which I have given the donation, that amount will be utilized against that or not. Vis-a-vis, when you look at the grant side of it, grant के case में generally ऐसा है that a grant maybe can be for a specific purpose. And that's the overall outline or the background when you look at them together. Though again, when you go to the specifics of these organizations, you would also find very acute dissimilarities between both of them. But still, ये एक overall structure है जिसके ऊपर they are built upon, and on the basis of which we go forward. Now, before I go to the exemptions, जैसा हम सब जानते हैं कि ये दोनों सर्विस की एक तरीके से हम मानते हैं ये सर्विस है, और एक नोटिफिकेशन नंबर 12/2017 है जीएसटी के अंदर, जहां पे सर्विसेज को एग्जेम्पशन दिया गया है. तो बहुत सारी सर्विसेज हैं चैरिटेबल और एजुकेशन वाली जिनको जीएसटी से बाहर रखा गया है ब्रिंगिंग एन एग्जेम्पशन नोटिफिकेशन. सो लेट्स लुक एट द एग्जेम्पशन नोटिफिकेशन. बट the first question I think which all of us should answer is that is at the threshold only, and that threshold is whether all the activities which they are taking or which they are doing, is it really covered in the definition of supply or not? Because if we can answer this question very clearly, that either they are covered or not covered, then it really makes sense to go to the exemption notification. Because at the threshold only, if somebody can say that no, the activities which this charitable or educational institutions are undertaking, it is not covered by the definition of supply, then in that case, there is no reason as such why somebody would still go to the exemption and find what is written in the exemption notification. So before we again read that, I'm sure all of us know, all of us have read it again and again, but it makes sense again to apply these three concepts or parts of how one would really read the levy provision. That is, हमको किस तरीके से आगे बढ़ने की जरूरत है. First of all, we have to identify of a particular activity whether it is covered under the scope of supply or not, or the activity that is it is for the supply of goods or services for a consideration. If it is covered, then the second part is whether it is in course and furtherance of the business. And I think ये एक वो point है जहाँ पे सबसे बड़ा challenge या contradiction है इन दो तरीके के sectors के बारे में, that is charitable and educational. Because business in general terms, which what all of us really understand is business के अंदर the underlying purpose of undertaking any business activity is profit. Because and ये दोनों उसकी बिल्कुल विपरीत है, क्योंकि यहाँ पर profit is something which is never the the bottom line for which they are working, though part and parcel you might have a surplus, to which a lot of people would not like to call it as a profit also, but they would like to call it as a surplus one. And अगर ये दोनों हम जो barriers है इसको cross कर भी लेते हैं, then it is really important to look at that whether we have an exemption in this regard or not. So before you go forward, again, 7.1, it makes sense to read the definition. It says all forms of supply of goods or services or both, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease or disposal, made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in course and furtherance of the business. And you see three things which have been underlined and marked in bold, which are very important again from this perspective when we are looking at an educational institution or when we are looking at a charitable institution. That is, whether there is any form of supply of goods and services happening. If yes, then whether it is made or agreed to be made for a consideration. If yes, then whether it is in course and furtherance of the business. और अगर तीनों में से कोई भी एक चीज है जिसमें the answer is not confident in yes, or there is to answer this, it becomes a very difficult proposition to answer this, then probably we can say that at the threshold of the levy only, you are not sure whether the transaction comes within the levy or not. And at that point only, maybe I can look at and by saying that I am not covered by the definition of supply, so I would not go and look at the levy also, and I would not look at the exemptions also. So when you read those three things, one thing which really comes out is कि अगर हम देखें इंडियन कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एक्ट 1872 के हिसाब से, तो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एक्ट में एक प्रॉमिसर होगा, एक प्रॉमिसी होगा और एक कंसिडरेशन होगा उस केस के अंदर. एंड प्रॉमिसर, प्रॉमिसी, कंसिडरेशन, दे हैव बीन क्लियरली डिफाइंड इन द कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एक्ट. और अगर वो तीनों चीजें हैं साथ में और एक ऑफर है, ऑफर का एक्सेप्टेंस है, चाहे वो ओरल हो चाहे वो रिटर्न हो, किसी भी तरीके से हो, बट अगर वो ऑफर, उसका एक्सेप्टेंस प्रॉमिसर प्रॉमिसी द्वारा और उसका कंसिडरेशन अगर वो एनफोर्सिएबल है, मतलब अगर उससे बाध्य किया जा सकता है उन्हीं दो लोगों को, जिन दो लोगों के बीच में अग्रीमेंट हुआ है, देन वी से दैट बिकम्स एन एनफोर्सिएबल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट. And when we read the definition of supply, all of us understand and realize that the definition of supply clearly has all the ingredients to call it as to be covered by the provisions of the Indian Contract Act 1872 and to call it as an enforceable contract. And once we say that there is an enforceable contract which has been envisaged in section 7.1a, that means there has to be a supply by a supplier and there has to be a payment of consideration by a recipient. तो सप्लायर का रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी और रोल भी फिक्स्ड है और रिसिपिएंट का रोल और रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी भी फिक्स्ड है. रिसिपिएंट हैज टू पे द कंसिडरेशन एंड सप्लायर हैज टू डू अ सप्लाई, and supplier has to precede the consideration in a sense that there has to be an activity which has to be agreed, and against that there has to be consideration which has to come from it. Rather than when we look at it the other side, क्या सप्लाई नहीं है, और जहां पर मुझे लगता है at the initial point some of us make this mistake by saying that we look at in the reverse manner, that is there any money which is coming from one person to another, and if there is a money which is coming, then rest all other things they are assumptive in nature. तो जैसा मैंने पहले कहा, on the left hand side what you see that there has to be an enforceable contract, there has to be supply by a supplier and payment of consideration by a recipient, and the chronology has to be like this only. The timing can be a little different of when the consideration will come or when the supply would happen, but that's how the chronology of the agreement has to be. But what we really look at is in some of the cases, specifically charitable or education ki case pe, that we say that, see, is there a money which is flowing from one person to another, and if there is a money flowing from one person to another, the person who is making the payment is termed as the recipient. हम उसका नाम, उस पेयर को हम recipient का दर्जा दे देते हैं, और जैसे हम उस रिसिपिएंट का दर्जा देते हैं तो बाकी सब चीजों का वी हैव टू ओनली डू अ फिल इन द ब्लैंक्स. सो दैट मींस द पर्सन हु इज रिसीविंग इट, हु इज कॉल्ड अ पेई जनरली, we tell him that now this person is a supplier, and now we have a recipient, we have a supplier, and hence whatever has happened between them, it becomes a contract which we assume to be enforceable in nature. And that is why in lot of the cases in the charitable institution, when somebody says that I want to give a donation of 10,000 rupees, subject to कि आप इस 10,000 रुपए से, for example, let's say it's a charitable institution, कि आप ये करेंगे कि जो पंछी हैं उनको आप रोज खाना खिलाएंगे, and that's what I want you to do. So I want you to actually, जिसको हम हिंदी में नॉर्थ इंडिया में जो कॉन्सेप्ट है, we call it jeev daya. So we say that all these birds and all these things which are there, so I'll pay you 10,000 rupees to this trust. You have the objective of taking care of the birds and other animals, so I'm paying this to you. What you have to do is you have to ensure that you feed all these birds with the amount which I'm giving to you. Now any which way that trust was doing this activity, वो any which way ये कर रहे थे, but उन्होंने बोला कि ये मैं specific purpose के लिए आपको पैसा दे रहा हूँ. And because lot of us are influenced by the flow of money, we say, see, now there is a money which is coming at 10,000 rupees coming from the person to that particular institution. उसको ये बोला गया है कि चूंकि आप खाना खिलाएंगे पक्षियों को, so that's a supply which is happening. And the supply which is happening, the beneficiary can be somebody else. That's not a problem because GST law में recipient और beneficiary का concept अलग-अलग है. They can be different person, they can be same also. So because the recipient is the person who is actually making the payment, तो जिसने payment करा है वो recipient बन जाएगा. जो खाना पक्षियों को खिला रहा है, that person becomes the supplier. And दोनों के बीच में जो आपसी सहमति से जो पर्ची दी गई, वो इंस्टीट्यूशन ने जो पर्ची दी 10,000 रुपए की काट के, जिसको वो अदरवाइज डोनेशन का नाम देते हैं या ग्रांट का नाम दे सकते हैं, नाउ सडनली दैट बिकम्स एनफोर्सिबल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बिटवीन बोथ ऑफ देम एंड इट बिकम्स अ सप्लाई. And that's how we generally try to understand this, and we say that it's a contract of supply in this case. The important point to understand is that GST is a tax on supply of goods and services, and GST is not a tax on income or receipts. Just because paisa aa raha hai, that really does not mean that it will be leviable to tax. And in this background, why am I bringing this here is, now you read the definition of consideration, how it is written. And it says consideration in relation to a supply of goods or service, so both includes any payment made or to be made, whether in money or otherwise, in respect of, in response to, or for inducement of supply of goods and services. And clearly यहाँ पर there is a link between the payment which has to happen, and that payment has to be in respect of and response to an inducement for supply of goods and services. So again, it becomes important that we analyze some terms, and let's try to understand what is the meaning of word payment, because payment शब्द को इस पूरे कानून में कहीं define नहीं कर रखा है. And because again payment has not been defined, it makes sense to go back to the dictionary and let's try to find out the dictionary meaning of it. और dictionary meaning में जब हम payment शब्द पढ़ते हैं तो it says performance of an obligation by the delivery of money or some other valuable things accepted in partial or full discharge of the obligation, or money or other valuable things so delivered in satisfaction of an obligation. So first of all, there has to be some obligation, and against discharge of that particular obligation, when somebody is basically giving or some other valuable consideration, then it is treated as a payment. Now think of a situation when all those charitable trust or educational institutions, when they receive grants of a very specific nature. Like for example, we have a very genuine and a noble philanthropic organization in Jaipur, and I'm sure all of us have heard the name of it. It is called Jaipur Foot. They provide artificial limbs, and those artificial limbs are basically for all those people who unfortunately do not have legs or hands. In that case, then there is an artificial leg, and that is being basically given to the poor and the needy ones who cannot otherwise afford it. Now, this is again a philanthropy activity. Lot of the corporates and other people who have to actually spend money in the CSR, who have to actually make payments for the purpose of the CSR activities, they give donations, and the donations are in such manner where it is being generally told that if in case in next 6 months you put, let's say, 600 artificial limbs to 600 needy people, then per artificial limb you would be given this much amount. Now the point is, again, as I was speaking earlier, that otherwise that organization is any which way engaged in providing artificial limbs to the needy and poor without charging anything from them, because that's a purpose for which they have been constituted. But when any corporate says that we are ready to give you this specific grant or donation, subject to that you prove us that how that amount has been utilized or put to utilization, then in that case that grant which we have given to you would be successful, and you can retain that particular amount. Now can we really say that there is keeping apart कि क्या ये business activity है नहीं है? अभी हम वो second वाले barrier पे नहीं जाते, हम सिर्फ पहले वाले अगर barrier पे ही बात करें, is there really a consideration which is flowing from the corporate to that particular organization? which has been said where the grant has been just linked to the number of artificial limbs which has been given and which needs to be given to the needy and poor people. In this regard, again, it makes sense to basically go to some of the foreign judgments. So it's an old 2001 judgment. Almost similar facts basically, जहां पर चर्च स्कूल फाउंडेशन को कुछ पैसा दिया गया और जो पैसा दिया गया उसके पीछे का पर्पस ये था कि आप इस पैसे से स्कूल का बिल्डिंग बनाएंगे. And again, the question was whether it will be leviable to European VAT or not. I have highlighted specific lines in this regard when this judgment was delivered. So what did they say? They say, for example, a loan facility provided by a bank to a property company for use on a specific development give rise to both a legal relationship, debtor-creditor, reciprocal performance, drawdown application. There is a direct link between carrying out of the development and the drawdown of the loan, but the development is not not a supply of service for the loan. Rather, it is effected with the loan. It is not a quid pro quo, but a quid cum pro. It is appropriate to apply both the tests, both tests to the fact to this case to see if either of them is satisfied. And it brings out a very beautiful concept as to say कि वो जो पैसा है उस पैसे के अगेंस्ट में हमने कुछ करके दिया है, उस पैसे को इस्तेमाल करके हमने कोई चीज करी. And that's what the difference they have tried to bring in, whether it is quid pro quo or it is a quid cum quo. So generally जहां लोन दिए जाते हैं, जहां पे लोन में स्पेसिफिक होता है कि आपको एक स्पेसिफिक पर्पस के लिए लोन दिया गया है कि आप ये काम करेंगे, in that case whether really it is an activity which has been done for the purpose, the person who is giving that amount, or in this case what we are discussing is the person who is donating, irrespective that donation is general in nature or it is specific in nature. And I think if that question can be answered positively by saying that no, ultimately all these donations, ये डोनेशन देने का एक तरीका है जहां पे कोई बोल रहा है आई ट्रस्ट द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, सो यू टेक द मनी एंड डू व्हाटएवर यू वांट टू डू. सेकंड इज आई ट्रस्ट द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन बट आई वांट दिस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन टू इन्वेस्ट दिस मनी इनटू द स्पेसिफिक पर्पस ऑफ इट. And third is, I trust the organization, I trust the activities, but I want them to actually do this particular activity and then tell me that how society has been benefited by that regard. And all of this basically leads to a conclusion by saying that it is nothing else but it is a donation or a flow of money by one person to another which is happening, where there is no reciprocal supply which has happened, or there was never an obligation to make a supply to that particular person in this regard. And that is why this would not come in that in the criteria of consideration. तो जहां पर स्पेसिफिक डोनेशंस हैं, जहां पे स्पेसिफिक ग्रांट्स हैं, at least my understanding is there is no requirement as such to go to the exemption entry. There is no requirement as such to look for कि हम exemption में क्या ढूंढ सकते हैं and whether we have to come out of GST because of exemption, but maybe at the threshold only we are out of it. Now let's come to something where there is quid pro quo. वहाँ पे कुछ ऐसा है जैसे for example education, जहाँ पे I am the student and I am, let's say, going to a particular college and I am telling the college is telling me that we will charge this much amount of fees and this much amount of fees is for the whole year where we will give you education. Now that education is recognized, not recognized, अभी for the time being हम उस पर discussion ना करके हम इस बारे में discuss करते हैं कि पहला क्या ये supply में cover होता है या नहीं होता है. And again, when you look at the definition of supply, and I'm sure again then somebody would have compared it, all of you would have known that from the earlier regime, when you look at service tax excise, there was no concept of undertaking an activity in course and furtherance of business. That means service tax उस टाइम पे भी लगता था, अगर हम चाहे बिजनेस एक्टिविटी नहीं भी कर रहे हो, एक्साइज ड्यूटी तब भी लगती थी, चाहे वो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग इन कोर्स एंड फर्दरेंस ऑफ बिजनेस नहीं हो. जब हम वैट रिजीम की बात करते हैं तो वहां पर जो वैट की लेविएबिलिटी थी वो डीलर के ऊपर थी और जो डीलर है उसको बिजनेस एक्टिविटी से लिंक करा हुआ था. When we come to GST side of it, everything which has been linked to the business side of it, the business activity, and when we read basically clause A, B, C of this definition to subsection 17, A, B, C is very important. और जो भी हम एक्टिविटी देख रहे हैं उन तीनों में से किसी एक में आनी चाहिए, एटलीस्ट फॉर आवर डिस्कशन. मे बी टुडे वी विल नॉट लुक एट D2I में क्या लिखा है. And it says any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, adventure, wager, or any other similar activity, whether or not for a pecuniary benefits. It says पहला चीज जो अगेन अंडरस्टैंडिंग में आती है, you don't read all other thing, you read what is written in the last three words, whether or not it is for a pecuniary benefit or not, and chapter ends. So it says कोई भी काम अगर आपने करा, चाहे you wanted to earn money out of it or not, that becomes immaterial. And because it becomes immaterial, that means even if you're a charitable organization या आप एक educational institution है, आप तो business की definition में cover होते हैं. But that's not the way anybody should actually read it, because the last 4 or 5 words which are coming here, before that there are a lot of other words for which we cannot, those words which we cannot ignore. And it says any trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, adventure, wager or any other similar activity. And if these activities, if any of the activity which is being done, या तो ये जो स्पेसिफिक 5-6 वर्ड से उनमें फॉल करती हो, या फिर इनसे कलर लेते हुए there has to be some similar activity, और वो एक्टिविटी चाहे पेक्यूनरी बेनिफिट के लिए हो या नहीं हो, then it will not make a real difference. So the point is, when we're looking at a charitable institution, when we're looking at educational institution, anything, we have to look at कि इनकी जो एक्टिविटी है क्या वो हम उसको ट्रेड, कॉमर्स, मैन्युफैक्चर, प्रोफेशन, वोकेशन, एडवेंचर या वेजर में कवर करवा सकते हैं या नहीं. And if the answer is no, that no, we cannot do that, because giving education is not trade, or giving education is not commerce, or it is definitely not manufacture. It can be a profession, maybe looking at, we will discuss that a little later, or whether it is a vocation or it is an adventure. तो क्या उन सब में ये cover होता है या नहीं होता है. और B by saying कि नहीं, जो एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन या चैरिटेबल इंस्टीट्यूशन की चलिए मेन एक्टिविटी की हम बात नहीं करें, पर जो और पैसे कमा रहे हैं, that is by way of renting, by way of basically giving a license to a restaurant to run a small restaurant in their premises. So can we say it is an activity or a transaction in connection with or incidental or ancillary to A? क्या उससे related activities है? And if not, better, let's put that in C category by saying any activity or transaction in the nature of subclause A, whether or not there is volume, frequency, continuity or regularity of such transaction. So किसी ना किसी हम तीनों में से एक में fall करा सकते हैं, and what should we really do? I think अगर इसको हम एग्जाम्पल की फॉर्म में देखें तो ज्यादा अच्छे से समझ पाएंगे कि क्या एक्टिविटीज हैं जो बिजनेस में आनी चाहिए और क्या है जो नहीं आनी चाहिए. एंड ये टिपिकल एग्जाम्पल है जो सीबीआईसी ने अपने ही फ्लायर में जब जीएसटी आया था तब दिया था. दैट इज, मतलब इसका एक पार्ट दिया था, रेस्ट आई हैव ट्राइड टू बिल्ड अपॉन. दैट इज, अगर कोई एक एक्चुअली ज्वेलर है और वो ज्वेलर जो है वो अपने एंड कस्टमर्स को अगर ज्वेलरी बेचता है, आई थिंक नन ऑफ अस हैव अ डाउट, इट इज इन कोर्स एंड फर्दरेंस ऑफ द बिजनेस. It is a trade and commerce activity which is being done by a jewelry store and it is leviable to GST. But जब वही ज्वेलरी अगर हाउसवाइफ अपनी ज्वेलरी किसी को दे रही है, तो CBIC has clearly said it is not in course and furtherance of business, though she might earn money out of it, though she might earn handsome money out of it. She might have lot of jewelry which maybe a jewelry store might not have, depending upon she comes from which family and how much amount she has saved. Still in that case, it will not be a business activity. And it will not be covered either in A or in C. Somebody might put an argument by saying कि जो housewife ने जो अपनी jewelry दी है, let's try to put that in C by saying any activity or a transaction in the nature of subclause A, whether or not there is volume, frequency, continuity or regularity of such transaction. But the answer to that would be no. And that's what CBIC has also said, for a very simple reason that C में आने के लिए भी the transaction has to be in the nature of A. और ए में जो ट्रांजेक्शन है वो लिखा है ट्रेड, कॉमर्स, मैन्युफैक्चर, प्रोफेशन, वोकेशन. सो कैन यू रियली से कि अगर मैंने मेरे असेट अगर दिए हैं किसी को, माय पर्सनल असेट्स इफ आई हैव गिवन टू एनीबॉडी एल्स, कैन आई रियली से दैट इज कॉमर्स और ट्रेड? आई थिंक वी हैव लॉट ऑफ जजमेंट्स टू से ऑफ द ओल्डर रिजीम बाय सेइंग दैट इट वुड नॉट बी कवर्ड देयर. द क्वेश्चन देन कम्स इज, अगर हम पहले पे श्योर है कि वो टैक्सेबल है, दूसरे पे हम श्योर है कि वो सप्लाई के बाहर है, तो तीसरे के ऊपर व्हाट शुड बी द आंसर कि अगर यही ज्वेलरी जो मंदिर में अगर कोई चढ़ावा आया या ट्रस्ट में जो डिवोटीज ने मान लीजिए अपनी ज्वेलरी दी और वो मंदिर और ट्रस्ट जो है वो ज्वेलरी का अगर ऑक्शन कर रहे हैं या उसको बेच रहे हैं, so that they can convert that into money and use those funds for the development and benefit of the trust or its or that particular temple only, can we say that becomes a business activity? क्या उसको हम business कह सकते हैं? And I think इसको समझने के लिए it becomes important कि हम कुछ पुरानी regime के judgments देखें, those judgments which are very relevant in this regard and which are useful. और जो judgment 1964 से होते हुए 2002 तक there has been a journey. Again, they are from the VAT regime and the sales tax regime. But बहुत सारे concepts है जो concepts over the period of time they have changed, and the concepts which have evolved as and when the law has also evolved and the law has been amended. So it is an old judgment of Abdul Bakari, which judgment clearly सबसे पहले बोला गया कि profit motive must है, treat any activity as a business. अगर profit motive नहीं है, then that activity cannot be treated as business. Though after that there has been an amendment in the definition in the state laws also, where that profit motive has to in some extent has been diluted. Then we have this Raipur Manufacturing Company Limited judgment of the Supreme Court, जहां पर ये बोला गया कि अगर टेक्सटाइल डीलर अपना स्क्रैप बेच रहा है तो बिकॉज उसका जो स्क्रैप है वो स्क्रैप बेचने के बिजनेस में नहीं है, चाहे वो स्क्रैप बेच के अगर प्रॉफिट भी कमा रहा हो, स्टिल यू विल नॉट कॉल इट एज एन एक्टिविटी इन कोर्स एंड फर्दरेंस ऑफ द बिजनेस. That means it can be an activity which is incidental, but you will not say that is main business is basically to sell the scrap. Then we have this another judgment of Board of Trustees, again Supreme Court judgment, very celebrated judgment, which clearly says कि अगर आपकी जो main activity है, if that does not constitute business, अगर वो business के criteria में सही तरीके से नहीं fall करती है या जो definition है business की उसके जो main limb है उस पे नहीं आती है, तो उसकी ancillary activities जो है वो ancillary activities भी business constitute नहीं करेंगे. And then third, which is the SAI Publication Fund, which is a very useful judgment. It has relevance in today's context also. And I think all of us who are dealing with charitable institutions, all of us who are dealing with education institutions, we are looking at their GST advisory and consultancy. I think we should be aware of this, where jahan par SAI Publication Fund mein this particular trust, they were in the main activity of spreading the message of Sai Baba. And while spreading the message of Sai Baba, they had some prasad CDs which had messages of Sai Baba, and they were giving it to the devotees, and against that they were charging a nominal amount. And the Supreme, and the question which came up whether it is leviable to VAT or not, and the answer was that ultimately all this publication of sale of publication और प्रसादम, ये ultimately जो साई बाबा का जो ये ट्रस्ट का जो मैसेज है और पर्पस है उसको बढ़ाने के लिए करा गया है. So and there is even if there is a profit motive involved, profit element involved, you cannot constitute as a business, because the main purpose of it basically is to extend the message of Sai Baba, which any which way is not a business activity. So sum and substance of it, when you look at it, all these judgments clearly what they try to bring out is you look at the purpose for which these organizations have been set up. You look at why these organizations came into existence, what is the main activity which is expected from them to be done, and all the activities which otherwise have been done. Is it supporting their main activity? Is it ancillary to their main activity? It is a byproduct of their main activity. And if the main activity you cannot call it as a trade, commerce, manufacture, profession, vocation, then definitely its incidental activities also cannot come under the ambit of the definition of business in that regard. And again, Sai Publication Fund का जो Supreme Court judgment है उसके अंदर there is a specific paragraph which is a very useful paragraph कि अगर हम ये business के concept को अगर dilute कर देते हैं, and this has been said way back in 2002 only, that if we dilute the concept of business, then practically speaking there was no purpose of writing in the definition of supply by saying in course and furtherance of business. So again, I'll read the highlighted portion which I thought is relevant here. It says that however be constructed, it cannot however be constructed to mean that a person would be dealer, and because in VAT regime the concept of business was linked with the definition of dealer. So it cannot be it cannot however be constructed to mean that a person would be dealer merely because he sells or purchases any goods, even in the absence of anything to show that such sale or purchase were in the nature of trade, commerce or manufacture, or an adventure in the nature of trade, commerce, etc. And then you read the last line again, which is very important. All this would render redundant if all the purchases or sales of taxable goods by any person per se, even in the absence of finding that they were made by a dealer carrying on the business of selling or supplying the same, are held to be taxable under the Act. So the point is, what I'm really trying to bring here is, irrespective somebody has given a shop on rent, irrespective somebody has received an income by getting a license fees for allowing a restaurant to work there, there is some sale of scrap which has happened, there are some old books which have been sold. The ultimate purpose which really needs to be seen is कि हम जब business की definition को देख रहे हैं, तो चाहे हम ancillary activity को देखें और main activity को देखें, पहली चीज वो business की definition में 217 ABC में किधर आती है. और अगर main activity जो है अगर वो ए में कवर नहीं होती है मेन एक्टिविटी, देन क्लियरली इंसिडेंटल एक्टिविटी चाहे वो अदरवाइज टैक्सेबल क्यों नहीं हो, वो यहाँ पर इस एक्ट के अंदर तो जो बिजनेस की डेफिनेशन है वहां पर इंसिडेंटल एक्टिविटी टू सब क्लॉज ए में इसलिए नहीं आ सकती बिकॉज जो मेन एक्टिविटी है वो खुद ही सब क्लॉज ए में कवर्ड नहीं है. So I might do an incidental activity which might otherwise look taxable, but because it is not incidental to an activity which is covered by A, hence all incidental activities, to my understanding, it also goes out of the definition of business. And then third, again, somebody might put an argument by saying कि ठीक है, you don't go by B, you look at C. जहाँ पर C में लिख रखा है कि वॉल्यूम, फ्रीक्वेंसी, कंटिन्यूटी, रेगुलरिटी होना ट्रांजेक्शन का कोई जरूरी नहीं है. But again, before that, what is written is any activity or transaction in the nature of subclause A. So the transaction or the nature of that particular transaction has to be in the nature of A. और अगर कोई रेस्टोरेंट दिया गया है किसी एजुकेशन प्रीमाइसेस के अंदर की जहां पे बच्चे खा सके, या मान लीजिए कोई एटीएम को किराए पर दिया गया है, या किसी मोबाइल कंपनी का टावर लगाया गया है, या कोई स्क्रैप दिया गया है, all these are incidental and ancillary activities. Because हम डिक्शनरी मीनिंग इंसिडेंटल और एंसिलरी का पढ़ते हैं. So incidental is something which happens automatically because doing of the main activity, while ancillary is something which you do intentionally so that your main activity gets support and it gets leverage in that regard. So the whole purpose of saying all this in terms of business and putting initial lot of time in this is that our thrust always we are looking at the initial side whether the activities are in the ambit of business or not. And if we can answer by saying that no, it looks like the activities are not covered in the definition of business, then irrespective there is quid pro quo, irrespective there is consideration, irrespective it is there in the exemption or not, we are outside the scope of the supply. And once we are outside the scope of supply, there is nothing in this act which we should look at while looking at the taxability. Now, coming to the educational institutions, somebody might say that education, at least in today's world, it is very commercialized in nature. Matlab, we have high-end schools, we have schools which charge a lot of money, they charge for air conditioning, they charge for expensive accessories for the students, be it a school or a college, anything of that sort. So can we really say that just because they are an educational institution, jahan pe education is something which government is propagating, that is part of our constitution also, that's one of my rights also, can I really say that it is not commerce? And again, answer to that comes from one of the old judgments of Supreme Court in case of TMA Pi Foundation, where what really Supreme Court has said is that education is you can comprehend as an occupation. That no doubt that it might look like an activity which might have a lot of commercial stakes involved, but it is not a trade, it is not commerce, it is not manufacture, it is not profession also. Because profession practically is that profession you have to link it to an individual who has taken some systematic knowledge. So maybe you can say doctor is a professional, but a hospital cannot do a profession. Or maybe a teacher can be a professional, but an educational institution cannot be a professional. So education institution, all those are running, basically it's a full-time occupation. And again, जब हम business की definition देखते हैं, we realize that word occupation is missing. It is not there in A, it is not there in C, it is not there in B also. So maybe one of those points also which gets a support by saying that they are into occupation, which is not covered with the definition of business which is here, and that's why we can take a stand by saying that it is not covered by the definition. In fact, there is another judgment of the Supreme Court, Modern Dental College. What again it clearly said, no, though it is not in respect of the fiscal revenue laws, but basically it says that education is treated as a noble occupation on no profit and no loss basis, and those who establish or managing the educational institutions are not expected to indulge in profiting or commercializing the noble activity. So even if what is basically it is expected is, even if it is a high-end school which we understand or very expensive college, still in that case it is still called as a noble occupation, where the intention should be to not to earn profit or to incur any loss, and it is expected that there will be no profiting in this regard. But in spite of that, even if you see, if one realizes that there is generation of surplus and there is generation of not, in fact, minuscule surplus, but a very handsome surplus in that regard, still a view can be taken by saying that it is not covered by the definition because it becomes an occupation in that regard. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say in the initial part of it is basically, it's the primary objective is basically, if it is not business, then all incidental activities, to my understanding, they are not covered by the definition of business also, and hence it could be out of the scope of business. But if the primary activity is basically to carry out the commercial objectives in mind, then even if the profit is applied towards a charitable cause, it would still be covered by the definition of commerce, and it will be covered by the definition of business only. And I think what I understand is in income tax also, when you look at 12AA, where they talk about the general public utility and the application of funds there. So they have an exception there by saying that ultimately, if any activity which is in nature of trade and commerce, but if it has been done as an incidental activity to have the overall objective of that particular general public utility, then to certain amount it will not be treated as it will still be treated as a charitable activity. वही लॉजिक जब हम यहाँ पर बिजनेस की एक्टिविटी देखते हैं, आई अंडरस्टैंड दैट लॉजिक वर्क्स हियर बाय सेइंग अगर आपके मेन पर्पस कमर्शियल एक्टिविटी नहीं है, देन इंसिडेंटल एक्टिविटीज बेसिकली कैन नॉट बी कवर्ड. So that's what I understand at the initial phase. Now, even after that, if somebody takes a view by saying that no, still I understand that my activities have commercial involvement, I cannot say that if I'm running a specific institution in this regard or educational institution, I would not be comfortable in saying that I am outside the scope of business. So I would like to take a registration, but still I would like to explore whether there are exemptions available. So for that, we will go to the exemption. Somebody might take a view by saying that if whatever I was saying up till now was true, then what was the purpose of giving an exemption in the exemption notification? For that, there is a clear understanding, and there are a lot of Supreme Court judgments say that if just because there is an exemption entry which exists in the exemption notification, that automatically does not make a transaction taxable. So just because हम exemption notification में देखते हैं कि 12AA वाले institution को exemption दिया गया है, या educational institutions के केस में बोला गया है कि उनकी certain activities के ऊपर tax नहीं लगेगा, that automatically does not mean कि हम supply की जब definition पढ़ रहे हैं तो हमको ये मानना पड़ेगा कि वो supply में उधर covered है. But in spite of that, when we look at the exemption, so now earlier service tax regime में हम क्या करते थे? So mind you friends, again in service tax, there was no concept of this business as such. वहाँ पे business होने की requirement नहीं थी, and that is why वहाँ जो exemptions थे पुराने वो इस तरीके से थे, अगर education is recognized by law, then it was exempted. It was affiliation to an international board for schools, it was exempted. But college which were affiliated to foreign universities, there the problem was because it was an education not recognized by law for the timing in force which is applicable in India, hence it was made taxable. And then certain certification courses which again had no recognition in law, they were taxable. Plus जितना भी हमें ancillary services से कोई पैसा आ रहा था, like restaurant, as I was given example, it was also treated taxable. But selling of old items and scrap, because it was leviable to VAT, and in VAT because they were not a registered dealer, and they were not paying VAT in that regard. Why am I bringing here? This is that this was the earlier position. So somebody who have naturally come from the earlier regime of service tax and VAT to GST, probably they would have continued with the same understanding by saying कि देखो business तो ये थोड़ी बड़ी बात हो गई understand करने के लिए. This is something on which I don't want to take this aggressive stand. But let's look at कि क्या same exemptions continue होते हैं या नहीं होते. Now when we do that, before we go to the education exemption entry, I would like all of us to read these two entries. Though this is not related to the topic, but it has understanding value here, because if we understand what government is trying to exempt in these two entries, then probably when we'll go to the education side of it, we will be able to understand in a slightly better manner. So when it says entry 26 says services by Reserve Bank of India, what is basically government trying to exempt here, or that notification entry 26 is trying to exempt here? And the answer clearly is service, जो भी services Reserve Bank of India दे रहा है, उन सबको exemption है. Basically, it's an exemption qua person. That is, exemption has been given to Reserve Bank of India, and any service which has been provided by Reserve Bank of India, that becomes exempt. When you read entry 30 says services by Employee State Insurance Corporation to persons governed by ESI Act. तो जो भी Employee State Insurance Act से covered है, तो अगर ESIC अगर उन सारे लोगों को सर्विसेज दे रही है जो इस एक्ट से कवर्ड है, then it is again exempted. So again, the exemption is not on a specific activity or a service, but exemption is basically qua person, depending upon that person is giving service to whom. And once these two things are fixed, that who is the person who is giving the service, who is the person who is receiving the service, then probably the way it is worded, what is the nature of service which has been given, that becomes immaterial in this case. So now in this background, when you come to entry 36, which is the important entry for the education, it says services provided by an educational institution to its student, faculty and staff. And B second, that is by an educational institution by way of conduct of entrance examination against consideration in form of entrance fee. So what practically happens is, अब again जो पुराना हम पढ़ के आए हैं, if I may say that I tried to influence your understanding before directly coming to entry 66, कि यहाँ पर exemption किसको दिया गया है, whether the exemption has been to the educational activity or the exemption has been to educational institution, subject to supplier is educational institution and receiver is student, faculty and staff. Because there is no specific reference of what is the nature of activity which has been done by the educational institution, but once the supplier and the receiver are fixed, that the supplier would be educational institution and the receiver would be student, faculty and staff, then in that case, whether all the activities which has been done by the institution for the student, faculty and staff, will that become exempt? And the second part, basically it is on a broader sense where जहां पर education institutions are providing services by way of conduct of entrance examination, maybe for their courses, maybe for another courses, for example for chartered accountancy examinations, when any specific college or any other institution provides a space and they provide their teachers as invigilators, then in that case basically that amount which has been received by those educational institutions, they are covered by this exemption entry AA, and they are allowed to take the exemption and not required to pay tax. There is a specific explanation which has been given in this notification, where what they have tried to say is, अभी हमने एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन की डेफिनेशन नहीं पढ़ी है, बट फिर भी हम डबल ए के लिए एक एक्सप्लेनेशन है which is very important, which says that it is clarified that central and state educational boards shall be treated as educational institutions for the limited purpose of providing services by way of conduct of examination to the students. तो जो ए के अंदर कवर्ड है, at least only for the purpose of A only, all these central boards like CBSE or state boards specifically, they are also treated as educational institution. So when we'll read the definition of educational institution, we might realize that they're otherwise not covered. So that's the generic definition of educational institution, which is given in the definition part of it, 2Y, which says institution providing services by way of, and then it has three specific limbs: preschool education or education up to higher secondary school or equivalent. Second, education is part of curriculum for obtaining qualification recognized by any law for the time being in force. And third, education is part of approved vocational education course. So again, when you look at it, basically जो पूरा life cycle एक student का, वो अगर it is preschool education or education up to higher secondary or equivalent. Now the first question which comes is there any recognition to a preschool education? And the answer is no. So for running a preschool education, basically there is no requirement as such where it has to be recognized by law. That is this nursery, pre-nursery, prep, LKG, UKG, all these are called as preschool education basically. And for that, anybody who's running into those schools, they need not take any, that is not recognized by any law for the time being in force, because that's treated as a preschool education. And anybody who's running those schools, they are covered by the definition of education institution. तो वो सारे एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशंस जो फीस चार्ज कर रहे हैं छोटे बच्चों से, और दे प्रोवाइडिंग एनी सर्विस टू देयर फैकल्टी और स्टाफ, दे आर कवर्ड irrespective that their courses are not recognized by any law for the time being in force. Then comes to the school where we say that education is up to higher secondary or equivalent, that is we call it the 12th or equivalent. The important point which comes is what is the meaning of equivalent. Equivalent का क्या मतलब है? Equivalent का क्या ये मतलब है कि अगर मान लीजिए कोई प्राइवेट कोचिंग चला रहा है और वो वहां पर 12th तक के बच्चों को मान लीजिए ट्यूशन देता है, so can he really say that there is an education which has been provided by him to the students? And those students basically have been imparted with an education which is equivalent to class 12, because when you really look at यहाँ पर क्लॉज 1 के अंदर कहीं पे भी ये रेफरेंस नहीं है that has to be recognized by law. But my understanding would say that this would not be the correct way of looking at it, because it says higher secondary school or equivalent. And higher secondary, specifically, it is recognized what is the meaning of higher secondary. So basically, any education which is, even if it is given by a tuition teacher, if I've taken that education, and after taking that, it can be said that it is equivalent to higher secondary, and the parameters which are set by these boards are met, then in that case I can really say it is equivalent education. Otherwise, getting knowledge from the tuition, I may have a knowledge which is better than anybody else who has actually taken that higher secondary education, but still, to my understanding, for the purpose of this definition, they would not be covered here. Then comes the education after school, where education is part of the curriculum for obtaining a qualification recognized by any law for the time being in force, and this covers all kinds of bachelor's courses and the post bachelor courses, graduations, and the PG courses and the doctorates, anything of that sort, where it is recognized by any law for the time being in force. Now, the question which really comes up is that what is the meaning of any law for the time being in force? Should we look at the law which are outside India also? So somebody who has taken an education in a college which is outside India, and unfortunately, let's say that education is not recognized in India, or it is not recognized by Indian laws, then can I still say that it is because it was recognized by the law of a specific country, that educational institution should be given an understanding or a recognition here? So again, my understanding, supported by some of the judgments of the older regime, would be by saying that we have to understand that the recognized by law for the time being in force has to be the law of the land, and law of the land has to be, that is the law which is prevalent in India. तो भारतीय कानून के हिसाब से जो भी एजुकेशन ली गई है, चाहे वो भारत में हो या भारत के बाहर, अगर उसकी मान्यता यहाँ पर है, then in that case only you can say that all those colleges, or maybe post graduation colleges, they would be covered by education institution. And third is specific type of which are covered by the approved vocational education courses. Now the question which really comes up is that अगर किसी स्टूडेंट को मान लीजिए एजुकेशन दिया गया and उसके अगेंस्ट पे फीस चार्ज करा गया, so that is clearly covered here. Let's say it's in school. Now let's say, and I bring a very far-fetched example, but unfortunately, the way it is, the exemption entry is written, this example comes up a lot of the times in mind. So let's say गर्मी की छुट्टियां जब होती हैं स्कूल में, where the school premises are empty and they are not being used by the school, then in that case, let's say the ground of the school is vacant, and the management decides that they want to give it on rent. And let's say when they give it on rent, one of the faculty comes and faculty says that my child is having a birthday party, and I want to organize a birthday party in the school ground, because it's a lovely ground. So can I take it on rent from the school, and I will pay the rent to the school? And the school says, no problem, we will give it on rent to you, and this is the rental amount for one evening which you have to take, and you pay this amount. Now the question which comes up is, can I really say that it is a service which has been provided by an educational institution to its faculty? And if it's a service which has been provided by an educational institution to its faculty, and as I was just referring to, यहाँ पर service का nature relevant नहीं है, but relationship supplier और receiver का as an educational institution और faculty होना जरूरी है. तो अगर वो establish हो जाता है, तो ये जो rent पर दिया गया अपने faculty का birthday party organize करने के लिए, can I take a view by saying it would be exempted? Again, you would have two views to say that. One view would be that yes, it will be exempted, for a very simple reason, that whether the premises which has been given on rent, whether it is an educational institution, and the answer is yes, it is an educational institution, because it is providing services by way of education as part of a curriculum or preschool or higher education. And second, to whom it has been given is the faculty. The another argument to that is that once I'm entering into the contract of giving a premise on rent to a person who is otherwise my faculty, then to that extent of the understanding which I have gone into by providing premises on rent, I am not an educational institution, and the person who is taking it, he or she is also not my faculty. तो जो देने वाला है, उसने देने वाले ने दिया है in the capacity of a landlord, और जो लेने वाला है उसने लिया है in the capacity of a user or a tenant in that regard. And because to that extent the relationship of education institution and faculty does not exist, that is why the exemption cannot be taken. Now again, this has not been tested in the court, but again, for both the sides, the arguments are there. If somebody would look at it from a planning stage or doing a transaction stage, the answer would be that no, the exemption should not be taken. But if somebody has taken an exemption, he has a fair chance to say that yes, he can still go ahead and claim the exemption in that regard. But the point of bringing this is that if somebody says that I want to claim the exemption, how can that be substantiated? For that, we have the Supreme Court judgment of 1990, Wood Papers Limited, and what this judgment really says is that when you're looking at the exemption entry, there are two parts or two steps to look at it. One is at the entrance, and once you have entered it, till that time it has to be read very strictly. You cannot give a liberal interpretation to it. So when I'm looking at the exemption entry per se, whether it was an educational institution and faculty, whether that relationship was there, once I say that yes, that relationship was there, then the second part of it, that now what is the modalities of it, I can read it in a very liberal manner as to say, then the nature of service does not matter at all. So once it has been established that it was an education institution and the faculty, if I was strict on that part while interpreting it, then at the time of implementing it, or at the time of actually looking at the nature of service, that does not matter कि चाहे वो renting की service है या कोई और service दी गई है, and in that regard I can still say that I'm eligible to claim the exemption. So I'm still saying that there are both views possible, but to take a stand by saying that it is not taxable, that is not the case, that it has no substance. It still has substance, but it needs to be tested. Now the question which comes, ancillary questions इसके आसपास जो आते हैं, मान लीजिए कोई एक ऐसा ट्रस्ट है जिसके अंदर बहुत सारे स्कूल चल रहे हैं, बहुत सारे कॉलेजेस चल रहे हैं, और वो अलग अलग प्रीमाइसेस के अंदर है. मान लीजिए उसमें से कुछ ऐसे इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं जो ऐसी एजुकेशन देते हैं विच इज नॉट रिकॉग्नाइज्ड बाय लॉ, और कुछ ऐसे हैं जो ऐसी एजुकेशन देते हैं विच इज रिकॉग्नाइज्ड बाय लॉ. Again, the question which comes up is, then in that case, what needs to be done? क्या हमको exemption qua स्कूल देखना चाहिए या qua institution देखना चाहिए या as a trust complete देखना चाहिए? The answer, again, the practical answer would be that it has to look at qua institution, but not as a trust as a whole. And just because 5 institutions are providing exempted services and 2 are providing taxable services, then you should not say that all 7 are into exempted, or all 7 can be classified as educational institution, but 5 should be classified as an educational institution and 2 should not be classified as an educational institutions. अगर वो ऐसे courses run कर रहे हैं which is not recognized by law, या फिर 1 और 3rd में fall नहीं करता है. Second, अगर non recognized courses है, again I think I have given the answer. But if somebody is taking a view by saying कि ये तो business के ही बाहर है, जो हमारा initial discussion था, then in that case, चाहे वो course recognized हो या unrecognized हो, that really does not matter, because you are outside the scope, not because of the exemption entry, but you're outside the scope because you're saying you're not into the course and furtherance of business. Sale of goods, will that be covered? Again, it's a tricky question to answer. It has 2 parts to answer. Where first, are you saying that all the activities of that particular institution were in course and furtherance of the business? If the answer is yes, then unfortunately there is no specific exemption available for the educational institutions to say कि अगर वो अपना कोई scrap निकालते हैं, asset निकालते हैं या कोई goods देते हैं, उस पर tax नहीं लगेगा. But again, the understanding or the position which has been taken is that overall activity was basically education, which is not covered by business. And even if they are selling goods, they are selling scrap, it is ancillary to that main activity of education, which is outside the scope of business. Approved vocational education courses, the definition has been given. यहाँ पे कोई ऐसा कोर्स जो एक ITI चला रहा है या फिर ITI affiliated कोई एक vocational training center है वो चला रहा है, या फिर National Council of Vocational Training का कोई modular employable skill course है, अगर वैसा कोई courses चल रहे हैं, then they are treated as approved vocational education courses. Now, अभी तक हमने वो पढ़ा जहाँ पे एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन ने जो सर्विसेज दी है उसके बारे में. This is a slide regarding the services which has been provided to educational institution. And what has been done in 1966 is जो सर्विसेज देने वाले हैं उनको 3 कैटेगरीज में बांटा गया है. पहली कैटेगरी वो है जो अगर प्री स्कूल एजुकेशन या एजुकेशन अप टू हायर सेकेंडरी इक्विवेलेंट को दे रहे हैं तो एग्जेम्पशन है. सेकंड वो है अगर वो गिविंग सर्विसेज टू एनी इंस्टीट्यूशन व्हिच इज प्रोवाइडिंग करिकुलम व्हिच इज रिकॉग्नाइज्ड बाय लॉ, इसको हम कॉमन भाषा में कॉलेजेस कहते हैं, और इंस्टीट्यूशन आफ्टर स्कूल, दे आर कवर्ड हियर. एंड थर्ड इज फोर्थ जो तीनों के लिए एप्लीकेबल है, मतलब स्कूल के लिए भी एग्जेम्पशन है, कॉलेज के लिए भी और अप्रूव वोकेशनल एजुकेशन कोर्स के लिए भी एग्जेम्पशन है. So पहला जो है where services have specifically been provided to schools, that is up to higher secondary, that is transportation of students, faculty and staff. तो अगर कोई ऐसी सर्विस दे रहा है जहां पे वो स्टूडेंट फैकल्टी एंड स्टाफ का ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कर रहा है एंड दे आर प्रोवाइडिंग दिस सर्विस टू एन इंस्टीट्यूशन, एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन, देन दे आर exempted. Or they are providing catering services or a midday meal service, then they are also exempted in this regard. And third is if there is a security or a cleaning or a housekeeping service performed in such education institution, subject to, again I am saying that all these three should be in relation to services provided to schools, then it is exempted. When you look at the colleges side, only one thing is exempted. अगर यही सब services colleges को मिली है, then in that case there is no exemption. The supplier has to charge GST, and it is not covered by the exemption entry. But if anybody is providing supply online education journal or periodicals, then they are covered by the exemption entry in this regard. Interesting thing, friends, is that when you look at this exemption which is providing for services which are provided to the colleges, जब आप उसका HSN classification देखते हैं, so practically online education journals और periodicals जो है, whether it is an e-book or not, क्या ये e-book के definition में आएगा, और e-book जो है वो online information and database access retrieval service है, या वो अपने आप में supply of goods से separately, या हम उसको इसमें इस particular HSN में cover कर सकते हैं, which is related to educational activity. That is itself a little debatable and an issue on which there can be two views possible. But again, on the description understanding of it says is अगर colleges को कोई online education journal periodicals मिले हैं, then it is exempted. Fourth is अगर admission related किसी ने कोई services दी है and it has been provided to an education institution, then that is exempted. Now again, in this regard, it will include everything because it uses the word services relating to. And relating to is it has a larger gambit. It is bigger in nature. It is not restrictive. तो अगर किसी ने examination papers की printing का काम किया है, किसी ने examination conduct कराने का काम किया और उसमें assistance दी है, all of that will be covered by the exemption entry and they would be able to take the benefit in this regard. Hostel facility, अगर education institution किसी को hostel दे रहा है students को, whether that will be exempted. There is a press release in this regard on 77/2017 which clearly says educational activity के साथ में अगर hostel दिया गया, it's a composite supply and the principal supply is educational activity. So it is exempted. But I think that logic is not required at all, क्योंकि जिस तरीके से हमने exemption entry को पढ़ा है, it clearly says services provided by educational institution to its student, that is exempted. तो वो service अगर purely सिर्फ hostel की अलग से है, but they are students of that particular educational institution, then there is no requirement to actually call it as a composite supply and one principal supply. It will be exempted altogether. You look at, there is a circular also issued on 12th of February 2018, जहां पर एक और चीज exemption entry जिसका reference देकर बोला गया. Otherwise, if you look at it, that any premises which has been given for the purpose of residential and lodging purposes, और जिसका declared tariff of a unit of accommodation is less than 1,000 rupees per day or equivalent, then also exemption is available. Now, in this very important word which has been used here is per day or equivalent. So what is the meaning of this equivalent? So there is an advance ruling in this regard which says is, if let's say the total rent of a particular hostel room is less than 30,000 rupees in a particular month, then in that case it can be said that the declared tariff of that unit of accommodation or value of supply of a unit of accommodation is less than 1,000 rupees or equivalent. And that is why, चाहे वो 1,000 रुपए पर डे के हिसाब से नहीं दिया गया हो, चाहे कमरा दिया गया हो पूरा for one particular month, but it is a unit of for residential and lodging purposes which has been given, and the word equivalent has been used. So even in that case also exemption can be taken. So all those are running a standalone hostel only, but not running an educational institution, but having a rent of a hostel which is less than 30,000 rupees, they, to my understanding, can claim benefit of this particular exemption notification entry, which is not covered by 66, but covered by that entry of less than 1,000 rupees per day. If let's say any school or a college which is running a hobby class, whether it will be taxable or exempt, again, if you have taken a view by saying that it is covered by in course and furtherance of business, then you have a problem here to say अगर hobby class का अलग से charge किया गया है और ये आपकी curriculum का part नहीं है, then in that case it looks taxable if it is not otherwise exempted because ये cover नहीं होता. The other way of looking at is in this case is that अगर कोई पैसा charge नहीं करा जा रहा है, then it becomes composite supply. where the principal supply would be the educational activity, and in that case, no tax would be payable. And that's what the CBSE supplier dated 1/1/2018 says. But again, friends, my understanding again to goes in this regard is to say is, once there is a relationship of educational institution and student, it really does not matter what is the nature of service which has been given. Once that relationship is established, even if there is a hobby class which is being run by the educational institution for the student, even if that is not recognized by law, even if that is voluntary in nature, it doesn't matter. According to me, the exemption notification 12 entry 66 1 clearly covers it, and they would be able to claim exemption in this regard. Otherwise, also, if somebody wants to look at an exemption entry by saying that, again, I want to go away on a very conservative side, because in GST, everybody wants to take a conservative stand. Then again, there is another exemption entry number 80, which says services by way of training or coaching in recreational activities relating to arts or culture or sports by a charitable entity registered under 12AA. तो अगर स्कूल 12AA में रजिस्टर्ड है और वो बच्चों को स्कूल के बाद में या कॉलेज स्टूडेंट्स को उसके बाद आफ्टर द नॉर्मल स्कूल और कॉलेज आवर्स they are running a sports camp and they are charging amount, then if they are registered in 12AA, they are eligible to claim exemption. If let's say somebody is providing yoga and for yoga they are charging a certain amount, can they claim exemption or they benefit? My understanding is they can claim under clause A only, they need not go into clause B. And in clause A, there is no requirement of having registration under 12AA of the Income Tax Act. So that is what I'm trying to say. Anybody who's running a yoga class, to my understanding, it is covered by recreational activity in relation to our culture, because yoga is something which is part of our Indian culture, Sanatan Dharma, since a very long period of time. You might be able to find certain judgment in this regard, and thus that is why anybody who's into this yoga activity, they should be able to claim exemption under this entry number 80. Then on the canteen facility, there have been a lot of flip-flop from the government side. There has been amendment. पहले एक circular आया, जिस circular में गलती थी. So there was this circular जो educational institution के अंदर canteen चल रहे हैं. In that case, the first circular which came was on 28/2/2018, जहाँ पर ये बोला गया है कि चाहे canteen चला रहा हो educational institution या canteen चलाने वाला कोई और हो, मतलब it can be any canteen operator also. In that case, both would be able to claim the exemption. But they realized there was a mistake on 18/1/2018. A corrigendum was issued जहाँ पे इसके दो पार्ट करेगा और ये बोला गया अगर एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन कैंटीन चला रहा है और बच्चों से पैसे ले रहा है, then in that case it will be covered by the exemption 66A. बट अगर कोई कैंटीन ऑपरेटर और वो चला रहा है, in that case अगर वो स्कूल के लिए है, then there is an exemption available. But अगर वो स्कूल के अलावा है, then exemption is not available and they would be liable to pay tax. एंड देन उसके बाद में सर्कुलर विड्रॉ हो गया ऑन 31 जुलाई 2018, जहां पे ये बोला गया कि बेसिकली ये पर्टिकुलर इशू के ऊपर देयर वाज अ डिस्कशन इन द काउंसिल मीटिंग एंड देन देयर हैज बीन अ चेंज इन द रेट नोटिफिकेशन एंड अकॉर्डिंगली नाउ दैट सर्कुलर इज विड्रॉन. And why the circular is withdrawn now? Because there is a specific entry of 5% taxability supply of a restaurant service. When you read restaurant services, it includes canteen also, and then that is why anybody who's running a canteen in a college, that is liable to tax at the rate of 5%. But if that canteen is being run by the college and charged from the students or faculty or staff, then in that case there is an exemption available. तो कौन चला रहा है और कौन से premises में चला रहा है, I think that is important, और उसके हिसाब से there would be a taxability. Then there is hiring of vehicle. अगर मान लीजिए कोई educational institution vehicle hire कर रहा है, then can they really take an exemption in this regard? Again, it is very restrictive in nature. It is only for all those who are providing education by way of preschool education or higher secondary school or equivalent. And if they are hiring a motor vehicle for transport of students, faculty or staff to a person providing the services. तो हमने पहले देखा था एंट्री 66 में जो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन की सर्विस दे रहे थे वो एग्जेम्प्ट थे. यहाँ एंट्री 22 के अंदर अगर वो मोटर व्हीकल हायर पे दे रहे हैं एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन को अप टू कॉलेज अप टू स्कूल लेवल, देन देयर इज एन एग्जेम्पशन. बट अगर कॉलेज के लिए किसी ने बस किराए पर दी या कॉलेज के लिए किसी ने बस के थ्रू ट्रांसपोर्टेशन का काम करा, देन इन बोथ दिस केसेस देयर इज नो एग्जेम्पशन व्हिच इज अदरवाइज अवेलेबल. देयर इज अनदर एंट्री अगेन इन रिस्पेक्ट ऑफ ट्रांसपोर्टेशन वन में रियली एक्सप्लोर, दैट इज कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कैरेज. और अगर किसी ने नॉन एयर कंडीशन कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कैरेज की सर्विस दी है फॉर ट्रांसपोर्टेशन ऑफ पैसेंजर्स and which is not for the tourism purposes, then there is an exemption available. The only point, friends, which I would like to caution here by saying is that generally schools और colleges के केस में जो भी buses चलती हैं under the Motor Vehicle Act and under the specific RTOs of the states, there is a requirement to get a separate license, and that license is called a Bal Vahini license. Until the time that Bal Vahini license is not taken, technically they cannot run a school or a bus for the purpose of colleges. And that Bal Vahini license technically is not covered as a contract carriage. It is a separate category altogether. So we have three types of licenses which are given. One is as a stage carrier, second is as a contract carriage, and third is as a Bal Vahini. So to my understanding, probably in this exemption entry, all those colleges who want to take benefit by saying that their college buses are non-air conditioned and they have taken buses from somebody who has provided as on contract carriage basis, probably to my understanding that would not be the correct way of looking at it, and they cannot claim exemption in this regard. Then I think last few things, there is a training to government which has been provided. There is specific exemption entry, though not directly related to education, but it is an entry which a lot of the time some of us we skip. So this entry 72 says services provided to central government, state government, UT under any training program for which total expenditure is borne by the government. तो अगर हम कोई ऐसी ट्रेनिंग दे रहे हैं जिसका पैसा सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट, स्टेट गवर्नमेंट या यूनियन टेरिटरी एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ने बियर करा है, तो वो सारी ट्रेनिंग सर्विसेज जो हैं they are exempted and there is no liability to pay GST in that regard. I think with this I'll come to last two slides of mine, that is in respect of charitable trust. Why I have only kept two slides for this in this regard is for a very precise reason that to my understanding all charitable trusts, they are outside the scope at the threshold only. And they are not covered here until unless they are indulging in an activity which is otherwise trade and commerce. And to my understanding, if that is happening under income tax also, the benefit which is otherwise available to them, they would not be taking. But still, because there is an exemption entry which says services by an entity registered at 12AA by way of charitable activity. And in fact, friends, अभी हम जब educational institution वाला exemption पढ़ रहे थे, तो अगर हम ध्यान दिया हो वहां पर आपने there the nature of activity was not specified. It says services by an educational institution to students. But in case of a charitable activity, the exemption says services by an entity registered at 12AA by way of a charitable activity. So here nature of activity is very important. And when you look at it, it talks about a lot of activities which are altogether different from what is there in the income tax. So income tax में जो charitable activity की definition है, that is very wide. Unfortunately, under GST, if somebody is saying just because under I'm 12AA और वहाँ पे charitable activity exempt है, इसलिए मैं कोई यहाँ पर exemption है, maybe your answer ultimately your end result would be same, but the approach of not paying GST or the answer or the logic which has been applied would be incorrect, because the exemption which is here is very specific. It says activities relating to public health by way of specific to specified diseases or patients, that is HIV/AIDS or suffering from severe physical or mental disability, or in respect of dependence forming of narcotic drugs and alcohol, or it is in respect of advancement of religious spirituality or yoga, or in respect of education programs which is either for people who are above the age of 65 or all those people who are unfortunately mentally traumatized or abused, or prisoners of the jail, or abandoned orphan or homeless children. तो इनका अगर कोई educational program है which is even not recognized by law, that is important. तो अगर इनका कोई educational program है not recognized by law but run by an entity which is registered at 12AA, then in that case exemption is available in this particular entry. And last is preservation of environmental including watershed, forest and wildlife. इसके respect में जो activities हैं they're exempted. I made a mistake by using the word इनके respect में, because activities in relating to are exempted, and there is a lot of difference between the words in respect of and relating to. Relating to is a wide term, it is not a narrower term, and lot of activities which may be remotely related to any of these specific activities, they can still think of claiming an exemption in this particular exemption entry. Last is we have this entry 13. Basically, it is for religious trust. Anybody who is undertaking a religious ceremony, that is exempted. या फिर अगर कोई मंदिर की प्रेसिडेंस है, वो मंदिर जो 12AA के अंदर रजिस्टर्ड है या कोई रिलीजियस ट्रस्ट के अंदर रजिस्टर्ड जो जगह है, उनको अगर किराए पर दिया गया है, या कोई 1023C या जो इनकम टैक्स स्पेसिफिक सेक्शन 1023BBA के अंदर जो रजिस्टर्ड है, उन्होंने अपने प्रेमाइसेस अगर किराए पर दिए हैं, then they are exempted, subject to the condition that तीन जगह हैं जहां पर ये एग्जेम्पशन नहीं मिलेगा. अगर वो जो चीजें किराए पर दी गई हैं, if they are in respect of rooms, then the per day tariff should not be more than 1,000 rupees. If it relates to community hall or a specific banquet hall, then the rent should not be more than 10,000 rupees in a day. And if it relates to shop or space for business or commerce which has been given within those precincts or those area, मान लीजिए मंदिर के बाहर कोई फूल वाले को या प्रसाद वाले को जगह दे रखी है और वो अपना शॉप चला रहे, then if the rental amount is not more than 10,000 rupees, then exemption is available. So if the amount crosses these three barriers, then in that case they would be liable to basically pay tax and they would not be covered by the exemption entry. So I think, friends, I have tried to cover basically the major provisions which are there. Some of the things which I thought are relevant from the point of view of taxability and exemptions. And again, I would like to thank CS Sansaar family for giving me this opportunity to share my views. In case there are any questions, I'll be very happy to take those questions. Thank you so much.
Okay. I am
Yes, sir.
sharing few queries are there.
Yes, sir.
So let's discuss.
Yes.
This is from Amit G query.
Yeah, donation received from
Are you able to
anonymous.
see?
Should we show this amount in 3B in non-GST supply? I think the answer is no. It is not a supply at all. So it should not be covered in non-GST supply also. So there is no requirement to show that in 3B.
Okay. And
So there should be
next query
supply
is
as
from
per section
Shubham Ji.
7, then consideration, and then in course and furtherance of business. Anything fails and outside scope of GST. Correct, Shubham Ji. That's what I wanted to explain.
Okay. And
Yeah,
this is
clarity
from
on hostel
Abhishek
fees.
Ji.
I think on
He
hostel
wants
fees
to
I've clarified.
clarify
If it is
hostel.
being run by an educational institution, there is no problem. Any which way there is a circular available. If it is not being run by an educational institution, still you can claim exemption under that notification which says if the tariff is less than 1,000 rupees in a day, irrespective, you're not charging on the basis of per day basis, but it is on per month basis. But if the totality it comes out as less than 1,000 rupees, it uses the word 1,000 rupees per day or equivalent. So on the basis of it, you would be able to claim benefit. There is an advance ruling in this regard.
Okay.
School to a lawyer
Another
for some
query is from
services is
Naveen
covered
Ji.
in a reverse charge mechanism. So good question. If your school is registered under GST, that means you are saying that you are a business entity. If you are saying that you are a business entity, then any which way there is no exemption available under notification number 12. But if you are not registered, that means you are saying you're not a business entity. And once that happens, then there is an exemption available in notification number 12.
Okay. So it's a really wonderful session, and mainly most of the provision you have covered for the educational and the charitable institutions. So my sincere thanks to you for such a wonderful session and giving the answer of almost all the queries if you, people have. And today we have completed on time also. And I think one, two queries more are there. Let's see. Uh,
Yeah, I'll share the link.
PPT people are asking.
I'll share.
So if possible, can the PPT or PDF? So definitely we will share the PPT and also post it in the comment box. उसमें आपको लिंक मिल जाएगा, आप वहां से डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं. So once again, my sincere thanks to Yash Ji. A big round of applause for him for some wonderful session, and my sincere thanks to all of you for watching today's webinar. Tomorrow again we have another webinar on the faceless assessment and faceless appeal at 4:30 p.m. Till then, bye bye. Thank you, SG. Thanks a lot.